Welcome to this free workshop, Project Challenge number 2, Organizing Your Project, Agile, Waterfall, or Hybrid. So the challenge that every business faces is that they have to empower teams, and then the teams achieve the priorities, and that drives their success. But the challenge is to empower the team, and they may have a mixture of skill sets, of experience, structures, and there may be differences of process in the background as well. So all of those things need to be in place. So it's a very simple model, but that's what we're focusing on here, is empowering the team. Just to introduce Scatterwork, we work with big companies and small. Some of the bigger ones you will have seen, and the smaller ones are probably less well known to you. But we work at all organizational levels, and we've worked across many sectors, and also across the globe. So our focus is empowering teams, achieving priorities, and driving success. So any business needs initiatives, also known as assignments, projects, ventures, etc., to implement their plans. And project management is the skill set that does that. So this helps people finish on time, within budget, and within managed risks. And this is key for projects that are, for example, very expensive, say like infrastructure, building a tunnel or a railway or something like that. Or if a project is urgent, like climate action, and it really needs to happen as fast as it possibly can. It's also key for distributed projects. For example, a company might decide it's going to put all its data into the cloud, and to reduce overlaps and so forth. And that would be spread across different locations. Or it could even be global, where you have different cultures in different locations and so on. So the challenge is there, and that's what project management is about. So at Scatterwork, we have formulated that into a set of 9 challenges of project management. And the reason for that is I challenge you, what is how is it we do this, that, and the other thing? And then the answer to that is, well, you do this. So it gives us solutions. Whereas if we came at it the other way and just looked and said, what are the risks, or what are the roadblocks, something like that, we would get an item, but we wouldn't know what to do about it. So this formulation is intentional. And most of what's here, you probably recognize as things that have been in project management for quite a long time, but particularly down at the bottom, you'll see 7, how project management fits in with Lean Six Sigma. Because after all, Six Sigma is basically a way of identifying what needs to be done and doing it. So it's a type of project. And also, particularly in the last year or so, artificial intelligence has been coming into project management, and it can have a dramatic effect in some cases. So that's on our challenge. So the one that we're looking at today is number 2, organizing your project, Agile, Waterfall, or Hybrid. So just to give you an example of a case study that we were involved in, there was a global supplier of products that had pharmaceutical additives, and they were being sold in the Chinese market. So every single product had to be registered in China. And the partners and distributors passed on the challenges back to the supplier in Europe, who didn't have any access culturally to China, didn't speak Chinese, for example. And also the costs were high. So what we did is we had an agile workshop. In other words, we gave a budget of time, and we said during this time we'll try and work things out. But we didn't really know what we were going to come up with. But what actually came up with was a detailed plan saying this is the way you register a project. So a very predictive type project, by the way. And then by putting dates on that, you could check that the plan wouldn't hit important outages, like, well, in Europe, Christmas, for example. And then the next time a customer came along, the process was offered to them, and we said, now this is the way that we normally do it. And they said, very good. And then it was also said, and we think it would be fair if you carried half the cost. So they said yes. So the advantage for our client was that they halved their project, but they also got a stakeholder in China. So it made it much, much easier to do their projects and cheaper. So it was a really good solution. And from an agile viewpoint, the workshop was agile, but the actual system we put together was predictive. So we've been around at Scatterwork for quite a long while. The company was established in 2008, but I personally have been working on the idea of remote working since the 1990s. And we help organizations cooperate with the best talent globally so that they can accelerate their engagement, reduce travel overheads, and support better work-life balance, as well as, of course, getting the job done. And our consultants all hold PMP, and they're in various locations globally, India, United States, Egypt, and so forth. So if you'd like a quick starting point, you could visit our website at scatterwork.com, and you get a free project health check. And at the end of that, you can print it out, and you also get the offer to have a free call with one of our experts. And it also adds to our mailing list so that you then get notified of anything that's coming up in future. And to introduce myself, I've been involved in project management for some decades, and I've worked in a very high number of countries globally. And this is my speciality, so I'm happy to share it with you. So this is our challenge. How are you going to organize? How are you going to structure the work? So I'll give you the example that I met a year or two back. I was working with a company, and they have power stations, and they generate electricity. And they have power stations in different countries, including nuclear ones. And then they also buy and sell electricity. So if you're responsible for the electricity supply to a city, for example, you can go to them and you can say, well, we need, so much extra power. And they had an interface to facilitate that sort of buying and selling. And they hadn't decided if the team was working on an agile or a predictive basis. And they got into the biggest rows that I have seen in a workplace in a generation. People were almost hitting each other in meetings because they had completely different concept to how they were going. So they hadn't asked this question, how do you organize yourself? Is it agile or Scrum or predictive or hybrid? And there are a lot of words that are around there. But the two main ones are agile, which is a methodology that was written up at the turn of the century, and predictive, which is what was written down in the 1960s. And all the others tend to be versions of them. Okay. And we're not talking about planning in detail. I'm doing this on Monday and that on Wednesday. That's detailed planning, and it comes later. We're talking at a much higher level. So in reality, surveys show that probably the majority of projects are done by some hybrid methodology. So people pull the best from agile and predictive, and they use their own processes, and that's the way they do it. I would have one word of caution here, is that if you say, well, we're special and we have our own methodology, then you're taking over the ownership and the training for all that work. So if, for example, you use standard methodology, predictive, for example, you can tell people, well, go away and learn about predictive, and when you do, come back. But if you say, oh, our method is very, very special for us, then you're taking over the ownership of that, and that blocks you a lot, I think. I'd also make a comment about ways of working, because if you go back far enough, let's say 20 years, people used to think, well, a project is always done the same way. But if you think about it, that can't be true these days. For example, a startup pharmaceutical company has far less staff, far less money, far less procedures, far less reputation and so on than a company that's been around for 80 years. So they're pushing a new product development, for example. They're going to do it in a very, very different way because the balance of resources is different. So it's very important to think out how you're going to do it. Are you going to, have one or two people that are in the team and they mix all the time and they have quick iterations or what? It's going to be different in the startup compared to the other. But in general terms, the way of working is something that you need to think through. So, the tip is, okay, make a decision. So predictive methods are okay if you know in advance what you're going to get. So if you're going to build a tunnel or a road or something like that, you know what you're going to get. So predictive is probably a good way to do it. And Agile will suit situations where you don't know at the beginning exactly what's going to come out of it, and it will emerge as you move forward. But a lot of people think, well, they think predictive. They sort of say, well, when are you going to do it, milestones and all that. But there are lots of situations where you don't know. So you end up moving into hybrid. And as I say, it can be any sort of a mixture. But basically, all projects have a scope. That's the work you're going to do. They have a time allocated and have an amount of money allocated. And basically, they say to you, we want you to do this scope within this time and within this money. Then the question is, what's the compromise, And it may be that a project, in part of a project, if not all of it, is best done on this basis. You really need to think about it. So the challenges are here of, as I said earlier, fitting in. If you have too much of your own process and too little of generic stuff, then you take over the ownership for the training of people. So it has some advantages. So it matches better the technology and the methodology that's possible. Overnight understanding of Agile is unlikely. So hybrid makes it possible to introduce those ideas gradually. And it also allows you to work in minimum business increments, which is the same as in Agile. Every time you put your hand to something, you leave it so that it's still working. You don't, for example, dismantle a car to service it on a Friday, take the wheels off, and then leave it that way over the weekend. What you actually do is you put the wheels back on again so that at least the thing can be used as a car during the weekend. And then when you come back, you move forward. So minimum business increment, it might be, change the oil or I don't know what, but it's always a complete process. It can be difficult to track deliverables. And the product owner or the equivalent is most likely to turn up at the milestones. And the problem with that is that if you haven't delivered what they expect, they get very annoyed. They've gone away and they say, well, you were going to do this. And, I've been gone these last 3 or 4 weeks and I come back and it's all off track. What are you up to? So it tends to be a fairly challenging type of situation. So here's a tip, is that when you are starting your project, you ask the sponsor or the person who's giving you the assignment, which 2 of these 3 things need to be prioritized, scope, time, or cost. And they will tell you, of course, well, of course, it's all important. And the answer is yes, I know. But if we really get stuck, which of these is where we trade off? And it depends on the industry. For example, the aircraft industry, it always trades off in the area of safety. So in other words, it doesn't trade off on scope. It doesn't say, well, we'll sort of half fix something. It fixes it. And it might cost more and it might take longer. But scope is not going to be something that they're going to trade off on. Now, Agile is a process that was first documented around the turn of the century, and a flavor of that is Scrum. Scrum is well known, so I'm referring to it here. But the basic principles are the same across the board, even if the terminology isn't. So it arose, as I say, early in the century, and they put together, these guys that met, they documented an Agile manifesto. And the manifesto has 4 values: individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So what they're really saying is, don't get bogged down in processes. Talk to people and so forth. And that's okay as far as it goes. But then, having said that, they emphasize very strongly that you must do their processes, but it's other people's processes that they want you not to do. That's a bit double-edged. Working software, it came from the software area because people were being forced to do projects on a predictive basis, but it doesn't work with software. That's not the way software works. So what they're saying, it's better to have something that works than to document. If there's a toss-up. Customer collaboration over contracts. Yeah, that makes sense, is that, you're in touch with the people and you're close to them and so forth. And another one is responding to change. Somebody wants a change and they say, of course, we're very flexible, and predictive isn't. But the reason predictive isn't is because of the costs. If you're building a bridge and somebody says, oh, we want to move it, 50 meters to the left, obviously the cost, you just can't do it. So there are projects where it doesn't make sense to be agile. Yeah. But Agile is very good, for example, in software, because when you're in there, if you make a change, there's no sort of physical costs or virtually none. So let's have a look at Agile project management. And the assumptions that it has is that work is prioritized by value in a backlog by a product owner. So there's various things there. One of them is that there's a backlog, and the backlog, in my way of visualizing it, is just a pile of all the things that you know you need to do. And some of them are actually to do the project, and some of them are because you're required to, for example, for safety issues. But they're all there. You have to do all of them. So they're all on the table. They're all sitting in this backlog. And you prioritize that, and you keep prioritizing it actively the whole time. And then the person who calls the shots is called a product owner. And at every iteration, the product owners say, I want to do this, this, and this. So, and that's their tool for adjusting, speed and focus and content and all that sort of good stuff. Is all wrapped up, if you like, in the decision by the product owner. Okay, this is what I want you to do next. Work is done in iterations. So an iteration typically has a fixed duration. Time box, they use that terminology. So we could say, okay, you've got the next 2 or 3 weeks, or if it's in research, you might have something like 3 months. And you might say, now we'll give it 3 months. And at the end of that, we want a position paper. So at the end, you would say, well, we found this, we found that, and we suggest we do this next. But the thing that brings it to a close is the timing. The time is fixed. That's the fundamental difference between the agile and the predictive approach. If anything hasn't been finished, it just sits on the backlog, and then the backlog is reprioritized. And if it is no longer a priority, well, it'll fade, and if it's still a priority, well, it'll get done. So that's very easy. And that also applies to changes. So you don't need a special change control mechanism from that viewpoint. And also to risks. If there are risks and there are things that you have to do and they've changed, they're all in the backlog, and then if they're important, they'll get prioritized. And the team, not management, decide what's possible. So this is very much an activity in recognizing the skills of the people in the team who are doing the work. And in principle, you could go to them and say, now we want to do this, 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 and this. And they might look at it and say, well, you can't do all of them in one iteration. I reckon we should go for this and this. And they're doing the work. So it probably makes good sense to listen to what they have to say. So one of the things about Agile is it doesn't work unless the mindset matches this. So if you have, typically you have management are not familiar with Agile because it came in, after they were students, and, they think of everything as predictive, which may or may not be a good decision. But if you want people to work Agile and they don't really know what it's about, then you can have problems. And as I said, you do minimum business increments. So an increment is something that can be used. So we start actually with a minimum viable product. So this would be a milking stool. If you're milking a cow, this is probably the minimum design. And then once you've got that, you do minimum business increments. So the next increment could be, for example, like that, where you put what would you call struts, I suppose you might call them, on a stool to make it stable. The other one doesn't have that. So it's useful. It's an extra thing. It's not a complete product, but it's a step, and it's a minimum business increment. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of Agile project management? So the short iterations, for example, if you say, right, you've got iterations of 2 or 3 weeks, you can always say to somebody, oh, yeah, that's great. Changes coming up, yeah, do tell us, and we'll feed them into our meeting. We're having one shortly. You can't do that with a predictive project where you have 6, 8, 10, 12-week phases. And if you do it halfway through, you say, oh, we've absolutely got to change. People are going to get very annoyed because they worked hard to get where they are. And all of a sudden you're saying, well, actually, you're running in the wrong direction. So it tends to be very demotivating for people. And it's also very inefficient because it means some of the work you did in good faith is lost. So because the cycle is short, you can afford to incorporate ideas and risks and new insights and changes and all that. You can incorporate them all in in the Agile approach. When you're pulling things off the backlog, they should be driven by business value. So you don't say, well, we'll do this and this and this first to tidy up or something like that. You look at the backlog and you say, well, if I did this first, what would it be worth and compared to something else? And then you pick out the things that have the highest value. And then another important feature is that the product owner must turn up at the demo at the end of every iteration. So if they don't do that, the problem is that, they say, yeah, just keep working, but you need their feedback. And also they need to see if things are not going the way they want. You don't want to sort of frighten them after 6 or 8 weeks and say, we couldn't do it. But every time you do an iteration, they come in and they say, that's not what I wanted. And you say, yeah, because, I mean, we did our best and that's where we got to. So it's a much better way of communicating with the product owner. And another advantage is that you don't have to ask people how long things are going to take, because you can do an iteration and then you can measure how fast, velocity is the word they use, how fast the team is working, this particular team in this particular environment. And then you can apply that to the work that is unfinished. And you can maybe get an estimated end date after so many iterations in future. But it avoids completely this thing of lining people up and making all the effort involved in that, and then they give you unreliable estimates anyway. So Agile is good for knowledge work. I mean, for example, if you were designing a process for testing something, you have to pick it up and inspect it and so on and so on. That type of thing can also be done using this approach. So it's not suitable if the cost of making change is high. So, as I mentioned, things like building roads and bridges, but it could be other things, maybe installing equipment in a factory and things like that. But Agile assumes that you can make changes, so that's fine. But if the physical reality says, no, it doesn't make sense, then it's not good to go by Agile. If people don't understand how Agile works, it probably won't work in the organization. And another thing about Agile is that people inside the team, they know, oh, well, if it's not finished, it goes back on the backlog. Or if it's tested, it turns out not to be right. So I've heard reports of people saying that sometimes people in the teams, they take what you might call a relaxed view of quality. And then they don't necessarily finish something and they think, oh, well, it's okay. It'll pop up again the next time round. So if a company can survive that sort of stuff, you're lucky. And as I say, there's mixed messaging with Agile, because they say, don't follow processes, but then they tell you, but use this process. So there's a bit of a double talk there. So another approach that you can have for Agile, and there are lots of different things you can do here, is instead of saying, right, we'll have iterations of 2 or 3 weeks or whatever, we say what we'll do is we'll work on the project, and when we've done so much work, so we might have, say, a help desk, and in between help assignments, they might have some time left that goes on a project, and then when there's enough done, then you have a look and see where they've got to. Okay, what about predictive project management? We all know bar charts and Gantt charts and schedule networks and risks, all those sort of things. That's well known, well documented, and I think most people know what it's about. And the key assumption here, compared to Agile, is that the scope is fixed. So the scope says this is what we're going to do, and it's not going to change. So, for example, if somebody is fixing your car for a 10,000 kilometer service or something like that, they have a list of things they're going to do, and it's not finished until it's finished. And if you turn up in the workshop to get your car back at the end of the day and they're not finished, they say, sit over there, we need another half hour or an hour to finish. Okay. But the end point is when the scope has been delivered, which, in contrast with Agile, where the stop point is when the time runs out, even if it's not finished. So in a predictive environment, the scope is fixed, and either time or cost is fixed, because you can't fix everything. And as they say, if push comes to shove, you need to know which one you're going to relax on. The work is divided and subdivided and so on, and then it's delegated, and then management makes all the decisions. So when should it be used? Well, if you have similar deliverables to previous projects, for example, you're feeding a product to customers, and you have some they're broadly the same as the last time, whatever it is that the business you're into, making turbines or fitted kitchens or whatever it is that you're doing. If it's broadly similar, then maybe you can do it that way. If the environment is stable inside and outside the business, so if then you can be predictive more reliably. But in this day and age, I'm inclined to think that the environment outside the business is not very stable. It's appropriate. Predictive project management is predictive when appropriate when the changes would be either expensive or impossible. And I mentioned you're building a bridge, for example. And once you've started, that's it. It may be that management prefers traditional methods. So if they're not close enough to agile, it won't work. So it might be better to, as I say, to stay with that, although it's not the best possible solution. And building a bridge is probably a sort of predictive project. So here's a story I had of where the method of working wasn't worked out in advance, and we were doing an application for quoting and selling insurance online. So we said what we'd do is that we would define a delivery date and collect the requirements and identify how long it would take to implement. And then the delivery date would be checked against the defined date. Was it on time? And we had a huge kickback from the regional manager. He got really, really, really annoyed. And I think what happened was something like this, I guess, was that it was, say, February or something like that. And we said we'd collect all the information, and we had about 200 or 300 people on the project. And then we put it on the table, and then we gave it to the IT people and asked them to work out how long it would take. And they told us, and the manager was annoyed. And I think that what might have happened is that he lost his bonus. I think he may have sort of promised his boss he'd get this done by May. And, he felt, well, he could push everyone and they would have to do it. But it doesn't work. In this case, it didn't work. The volume of work was too high. So it does have advantages if you know what the deliverables are, if it's similar to previous projects, and if it's if the environment is going to be stable, then it could be a predictive project that you go for. We've had this limitation about estimating costs and duration, and changes are always expensive. And it doesn't really work if you don't know what the deliverables are. So, for example, you might decide to refurbish a house, but at the beginning, you actually don't know what you're going to find. And when you go under the stairs, you might find a material that you can't use these days, and so on. So, even in something like that, people say, oh, yeah, it's all predictive in our industry. Maybe it's not. So here's an example. This is real, by the way, for a discussion. And the cost of motorways is increasing, and the railway wants to take new trains that have new features. And one of the things they wanted was a 40 kilometer an hour increase in speed. So that's okay. That's something fairly good. They wanted a tilting mechanism so that the trains could go faster on the curves, like a bike leaning over. And it had never been done for double-decker trains. So these are double-decker trains they wanted. So there was a good question. And then a smaller point maybe was that they wanted steps that would extend out to the platform so that you could get on and off with a wheelchair anywhere on the train. And they wanted modern information systems and high-speed internet. So here are some of the questions, and I'll just throw in my sort of quick answers to them. But in the real world, we probably have a much bigger discussion. So what project management way of working are you going to recommend? And what I would think of here would be that because the technology isn't proven, I would have an agile phase at the beginning where the job is to prove the viability of the technology. You don't know how long it's going to take. You don't know how many iterations and so on. But once you get going and people get ideas, they might say, this is fairly well known and so on. And then you could go into, in the event they didn't do that, they just went in as if they had a solution. And what actually happened at the end was that the railway company decided not to switch on the software that would allow the trains to tip on the curves. What are you going to do about technological change? I mean, if you're doing a contract like this, then it'd probably be a year or two to the first delivery, and then after that there'd be deliveries during 5 or 6 years, something like that. Well, there could be a lot of technology changes in that time. And what are you building into your project so that the newer technology will be allowed for? So I'll give you an example for the trains. Do you put Wi-Fi in a train? Well, you might have Wi-Fi in a bus because it's it's in a fairly local area. It doesn't go too far. But for a train is moving around from one place to another, and any contact it has would probably have to go through the mobile phone network. So what they actually do is that they facilitate free access to the public phone network for each individual person, but not through a Wi-Fi system. A railway, here's a cultural issue. I mean, a railway is run like an army. You're somebody at the top and they tell you what to do and they tell you what time the trains are going to run. And then in the old days, they had a station master, and the station master had a few people working, somebody who sells tickets and somebody else who moves luggage around and things like that. So that's the way it works. But in this particular case, they wanted something more agile, I think, at the beginning. So, and what risks? Yeah, well, one of the obvious risks to me would be that the technology doesn't work, or it takes longer to sort it out. So I'm sure it could be sorted out. It sounded fairly viable. They had a proposal of how it should work, but it hadn't been proven. And any other considerations? Yes, because the delays actually mattered. And the railway had the program. They sort of said, well, we get these trains in such and such a year, and then we feed them into the timetable, which will improve the connection times and so on and so on. And they couldn't do that because the trains didn't arrive in time. So this is the challenge. How will you apply these ideas to your project? And as I said at the beginning, if you're interested, a good way of doing this was to go onto our website, scatterwork.com, and sign up for the project health check. And then when you've given it some thought, if you wish to go ahead, then you can select a time for a call, and we go through it with you and see where that leads. So just a quick bit of publicity here about Scatterwork engagement. One-to-one project coaching is for people who want to go on a project management course, but they just can't turn up, for example, every Monday for 5 weeks. So the trade-off here is that they get one-to-one in personal coaching or training of the very same material. And then the individual can choose the time of the next event each time they can choose it. So it doesn't have to be the same at all. It can move around from one thing to another. The trade-off is, of course, you don't get the input of the other participants because they're not there. Fast-track project workshops, particularly if you've got, say, a kickoff situation of a new project and you want to get it going fast. And instead of bringing together people who don't know each other and sort of saying you're the project manager, we can come in there and we can get that moving much quicker. Obviously, we do project consulting, strategic project learning partner. This is where we're your what you might call a sounding board for anything to do with training in the project management area. And some of it we might implement by suggesting some of our own services, but we might also integrate services from other providers in here, but you'd have a reliable view on what's available and how it works. PMP training, we also are in a position to offer that with an authorized training partner of PMI, and we have free workshops, and we have free project health check, as we've already mentioned. So I hope that was useful to you, and thanks very much for your interest.